6 months had passed since Henry Collins quietly slipped away. Spring had returned to Maple Street. The roses outside the old White House bloomed just as they always had, their soft fragrance drifting through the open windows every morning. Some neighbors said it almost felt as though Henry were still there. David thought so too. Every Saturday, he still found himself reaching for the phone. For just a moment, he would forget that there was no longer a father waiting to answer. Forget that the familiar voice saying, "Morning, son," had become only a memory. Grief was strange. It didn't disappear. It simply became quieter, like an old song playing softly in another room. One Saturday morning, David parked his truck in front of Henry's house. Beside him sat Noah, now 11 years old, growing taller every month. He had inherited his father's brown eyes and Henry's gentle smile. The old house had remained exactly as Henry had left it. David couldn't bring himself to sell it. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. Instead, every weekend, father and son came to clean, water the roses, and keep the little house alive. It felt less like maintaining a building, and more like keeping Henry's promise. Don't let our house stop feeling like home. Noah unlocked the front door. The familiar scent of old wood, vanilla, and fresh coffee still lingered inside. Grandpa's house. That's what everyone in the family called it. No one ever called it the old house, because it never felt old. It felt loved. David headed toward the kitchen. Noah wandered upstairs. He liked exploring Grandpa's room. Everything there told a story. An old fishing rod, a faded baseball glove, a shelf filled with family photographs, stacks of handwritten journals. Each visit, he discovered something new. Opening the bedroom closet, Noah noticed something hanging alone near the back. A navy blue wool coat, Grandpa's favorite coat. The one he wore the day he reunited with David after 25 years apart. Noah remembered it immediately. There was even a small tear near one pocket where Grandpa once caught it on a fence while helping him rescue a frightened puppy. Henry had laughed instead of complaining. "Some things are worth tearing a coat for," he had said. Noah carefully lifted the coat from the hanger. It was surprisingly heavy, much heavier than he remembered. He slipped it over his shoulders. The sleeves were far too long. He laughed quietly. "I look just like Grandpa," looking into the bedroom mirror. He almost expected to hear Henry chuckle behind him. As Noah placed his hands into the pockets, his fingers touched something. Paper. He frowned. "That's strange." He reached deeper. Inside the inner pocket, hidden beneath the lining, was a thick brown envelope tied carefully with blue ribbon. Across the front, written in Henry's familiar handwriting, were 7 simple words. "For whoever finds my old coat." Noah's heartbeat quickened. He untied the ribbon carefully. Inside were several folded pages, a worn leather notebook, and another envelope. The second envelope carried only one name, Noah, his own name, written by Grandpa. His hands began to shake. "Grandpa," he whispered. He hurried downstairs. "Dad." David looked up from the kitchen. "What happened?" Noah held up the envelope. "I found this." It was inside Grandpa's coat. David immediately recognized the handwriting. For several long moments, neither father nor son spoke. Finally, David nodded. "I think your grandpa wanted you to have it." Together, they sat at the old dining table, the very table where Henry had opened Elizabeth's final birthday letter. Morning sunlight streamed through the window. Dust floated lazily through the warm beams of light. Noah carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter. "Dear Noah, if you're reading this, then I finally had to leave my old coat behind. I hope it still smells like fresh air and coffee. Your grandmother always said I wore it far too often. She was probably right." Noah smiled through unexpected tears. Henry's gentle humor still felt alive. The letter continued, "There is something every man eventually learns. A coat isn't valuable because it keeps you warm. It's valuable because of where it has been. Mine has seen birthdays, funerals, fishing trips, snowstorms, hospital visits, and one unforgettable afternoon when it helped me find my son again." Noah looked toward his father. David quietly wiped his eyes. Henry continued writing. "Inside this coat, you will also find my little notebook. It contains names, just names, nothing more. Some of those people may not even remember me anymore. but I remember them, every single one, because each of them helped me become the man I was. Some offered me work when I had none. Some gave me food when I was embarrassed to ask. Some forgave me when I didn't deserve forgiveness. Some simply sat beside me when life became too heavy. I always wanted to thank them properly. I never found enough time. Maybe you can help an old man keep one final promise. Noah slowly opened the worn leather notebook. The first page simply read, "People who changed my life." Beneath the title, 37 names. Some had addresses. Some had phone numbers. Others contained only a first name and a town. David leaned closer. He recognized only a few. Many he had never heard before. Near the bottom of the page, Henry had written one final sentence. "Kindness is the only thing that becomes larger after you give it away." Noah closed the notebook gently. He looked toward his father. "Do you know these people?" David slowly shook his head. "I don't." Then he smiled sadly. "Maybe. We're about to learn something new about your grandpa." Neither of them realized that opening one old coat would begin a journey across several states, introducing them to people whose lives Henry Collins had quietly changed, without ever telling his own family. And each story would reveal that the man they thought they knew had spent an entire lifetime leaving pieces of kindness behind, one stranger at a time. The house was unusually quiet. Neither David nor Noah spoke as they stared at the worn leather notebook lying on the kitchen table. 37 names, 37 people, 37 stories Henry had never shared. David slowly turned the first page. At the very top was written, "Walter Morrison, age 12, Greenwood Veterans Home. Thank him." One more time. Below it, Henry had added a small note. "He once carried me when I could no longer walk." David frowned. "I've never heard Grandpa mention Walter." "Neither have I," Noah replied. For a long moment, they simply looked at one another. Finally, Noah closed the notebook. "I think we should go." David smiled. "I think Grandpa would like that." The following morning, father and son began their journey. Greenwood Veterans Home was nearly 3 hours away. The highway stretched through quiet farmland and small towns Henry had often driven through years before. As Noah looked out the window, he couldn't stop thinking about his grandfather. There had been so many afternoons together. Fishing, fixing bicycles, planting roses, baking apple pie. Yet somehow, Grandpa had still managed to keep an entire chapter of his life hidden. Not because he wanted secrets, because he had never believed kindness needed applause. The veterans' home stood on a peaceful hill overlooking a small lake. American flags fluttered gently in the spring breeze. Several elderly veterans sat outside watching birds gather near the water. Some smiled at passing visitors. Others quietly stared into the distance, lost inside memories no one else could see. Inside the lobby, a friendly receptionist greeted them. "Can I help you?" David opened the notebook. "We're looking for Walter Morrison." The woman smiled softly. "Mr. Morrison still lives here." She glanced toward a window. "He's 92 now. He spends most mornings reading by the sunroom." Then she paused. "May I ask who's visiting him?" David answered simply, "We're Henry Collins's family." The receptionist's eyes immediately widened. Without saying another word, she quietly placed her hand over her heart. "Oh," she whispered. So Henry finally sent someone. David and Noah exchanged confused glances. "You knew my father?" The woman nodded. "Only through Walter. For years, he talked about a man named Henry. He always believed someone from Henry's family would come one day." She guided them through a quiet hallway. Sunlight poured through tall windows. Photographs of young soldiers lined the walls. Many of the faces looked no older than Noah. The receptionist stopped outside a bright room. An elderly man sat beside the window wearing a faded army sweater. His silver hair was neatly combed. A cane rested beside his chair. He was reading an old Bible. "Mr. Morrison," the receptionist said gently, "you have visitors." Walter looked up. His cloudy blue eyes settled first on David, then Noah. He smiled politely. "I'm afraid. I don't believe we've met." David stepped forward. "My name is David Collins." Walter nodded. Then David added quietly, "I'm Henry Collins's son." The old veteran froze. His Bible slipped gently onto his lap. For several long seconds, he simply stared. Then tears slowly filled his eyes. "Henry," he whispered, My goodness, it's really you. David smiled through his own tears. No, I'm his son. Walter slowly nodded. I know. You have his eyes. Walter reached toward the chair beside him. Please, sit down. I've been waiting a very long time to tell someone about your father. Noah carefully opened Grandpa's notebook. Walter smiled the moment he saw it, so he finally let someone read it. He always said the notebook wasn't about him. It was about remembering the people who taught him how to be kind. David leaned forward. My father wrote, "You carried me when I could no longer walk." What did he mean? Walter chuckled softly. You really don't know. David shook his head. Walter looked out the window for a long moment before beginning. It happened. In the winter of 1976, your father had just lost his job. There was almost no money. Elizabeth was pregnant, and he was trying to find work anywhere he could. David stared in disbelief. My father never told us. Walter smiled. He wouldn't. Henry believed. Pride should never stop a man from asking for work, but it should stop him from asking for sympathy. Walter continued. One icy morning, Henry slipped while unloading lumber. He shattered his ankle. The company let him go. He couldn't walk. No paycheck. No insurance. No idea how he was going to feed his family. Noah listened without blinking. He had never imagined Grandpa struggling like that. Walter smiled sadly. I wasn't much older than your father back then. I had just returned home from Vietnam. I still carried more nightmares than memories. I didn't know how to help myself, but when I saw Henry lying there, I couldn't walk away. Walter laughed quietly. So, I picked him up, threw him over my shoulder, and carried him nearly half a mile to the little clinic. David smiled through tears. You actually carried him? Walter nodded proudly. He kept apologizing the whole way. I told him, friends don't apologize for being heavy. The three of them laughed. It was exactly the kind of joke Henry would have loved. Walter's smile slowly faded. That wasn't the important part. David frowned. What was? Walter looked directly into his eyes. I thought I had saved your father, but the truth is, he spent the next 40 years saving me. The room fell silent. Walter gently reached beneath his chair and pulled out a worn wooden box. Inside were dozens of birthday cards, Christmas cards, Thanksgiving notes. Every single envelope carried the same familiar handwriting. Henry Collins. Walter smiled. Your father never forgot me. Not once. Every birthday, every Christmas, every Veterans Day, there was always a letter. He never let me feel like the world had forgotten an old soldier. Walter looked toward Noah. Do you know what loneliness feels like when you're 90? Noah quietly shook his head. Walter smiled. I hope you never do. Your grandfather made sure I didn't have to. David slowly realized something. For 25 years, Henry had believed he had failed as a father. Yet during those very same years, he had quietly become family to people who had no one else. Walter closed the wooden box. There was one thing. He asked me if he ever stopped writing. I should assume he had finally gone home. Walter smiled toward the sunlight. I guess he has. Noah reached into Grandpa's coat pocket. He carefully removed one of Henry's old fountain pens. He opened the notebook. Beside Walter Morrison's name, he wrote two simple words. Thank you. Walter watched him write, then quietly whispered, No, thank you for bringing him back. One last time. The drive home from Greenwood Veterans Home felt quieter than the drive there. Walter's words lingered inside the truck. I thought I saved Henry. The truth is, he spent 40 years saving me. Neither David nor Noah expected that the first name in Henry's notebook would reveal so much about the man they thought they knew. If the first story had been this powerful, what waited behind the other 36 names? The following Saturday, they returned to Grandpa Henry's house. As always, David watered Elizabeth's roses. Noah opened the notebook. He carefully turned to the second page. The next name read, Margaret Ellis, Ellis Family Bakery, Brookhaven. Underneath, Henry had written, She fed us when we had nothing. I never truly paid her back. Brookhaven was a small town nearly 90 minutes away. It had one traffic light, one church, one post office, and according to the map, One bakery. When they arrived, the bakery looked as though time had forgotten it. A faded wooden sign hung above the entrance. Ellis Family Bakery. Fresh bread filled the air with its warm, comforting smell. The display window held homemade pies, cinnamon rolls, and golden loaves cooling on wooden racks. A little brass bell chimed as they stepped inside. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman wearing a flower-covered apron. Her silver hair was tied neatly into a bun. Despite her age, her eyes sparkled with quiet kindness. She smiled. "Good morning. What can I get for you?" David hesitated. "We're actually looking for Margaret Ellis." The woman laughed softly. "I've been Margaret Ellis for 81 years. What can I do for you?" David reached into his coat pocket. He removed Henry's notebook. Margaret's smile disappeared the moment she saw the familiar leather cover. She slowly rested both hands on the counter. "Henry," she whispered. He finally sent someone. Noah exchanged another surprised glance with his father. It was the second time someone had said those exact words. As though Henry had somehow known this day would come, Margaret quietly unlocked the small gate behind the counter. "Come with me. I think your grandfather would have wanted us to sit." She led them to a little table beside the kitchen where fresh bread cooled on wooden shelves. The smell reminded David of childhood. Every Saturday, Elizabeth bought bread from this very bakery. He hadn't realized Grandpa still came here after they moved away. Margaret poured 3 cups of coffee, then sat down. "So," she smiled gently, "how is stubborn old Henry?" David lowered his eyes. "He passed away last autumn." Margaret closed her eyes. A tear slipped silently down her cheek. "I thought so. When the Christmas card didn't come, I knew." For several moments, no one spoke. Finally, Margaret smiled through her tears. "He always hated making people sad. So let's tell happy stories instead." She looked toward Noah. "Did your grandpa ever tell you how he almost starved?" Noah's eyes widened. "No, he never talked about that." Margaret chuckled. "Of course he didn't. Henry believed difficult times weren't something to boast about." She folded her hands. "It happened nearly 50 years ago, right after he injured his ankle. He couldn't work. Elizabeth was expecting David. There wasn't enough money. They skipped meals. They sold furniture. They even talked about selling their wedding rings." David felt his throat tighten. He remembered none of it. He had only been a baby. Margaret continued quietly. "One snowy morning, Henry walked into this bakery. I could tell he hadn't eaten. He stared at the bread, but he kept counting the coins in his pocket. There weren't enough." Margaret smiled sadly. "I asked if I could help." He smiled politely and said, "No, Mo. I'm just looking." He turned to leave. I stopped him. I wrapped 2 fresh loaves, some soup, apple pie, and I told him, "Congratulations. You're our 1,000th customer. Today's meal is free." David smiled faintly. "My father believed that?" Margaret laughed. "Oh, he knew I was lying. He wasn't foolish, but he accepted anyway, because he realized I was trying to protect his dignity." She looked toward the bakery window. "Before leaving, he promised me, one day, I'll repay every penny." Margaret laughed again. I never expected him to. She stood slowly. "Wait here." She disappeared into the storage room. A minute later, she returned, carrying a heavy metal cash box. The paint had nearly worn away. She placed it gently on the table. Inside were dozens of faded receipts, old photographs, Christmas cards, and a stack of canceled checks. David looked confused. "What are these?" Margaret handed him the first check. "Payable to Ellis Family Bakery. The amount, $500. The memo line simply read, "For the bread." David looked at the date. It had been written almost 20 years after Henry's first visit. "There are more." Margaret smiled. "There are dozens more. Every Christmas, Henry mailed another check, sometimes $50, sometimes $100, sometimes more, always with the same words, 'For the bread.' I called him many times. I begged him to stop. He always laughed and said, 'I haven't finished paying yet.'" Margaret reached beneath the checks. She pulled out one final envelope. It had never been opened. Across the front, Henry's handwriting read, "Open only after I'm gone." Her hands trembled. I couldn't bring myself to open it. "I think It belongs with you now. She handed the envelope to David. Very carefully, he opened it. Inside was another letter. Short, simple, written only a few years before Henry died. Dear Margaret, you once gave a hungry young husband enough bread to keep hope alive. You thought you were feeding one family. The truth is, you were feeding generations. Because that kindness taught me something I never forgot. Whenever you find someone hungry, feed them. Whenever you find someone lonely, sit beside them. Whenever you find someone ashamed, protect their dignity. Thank you for seeing a man instead of his empty pockets. Your friend, Henry Collins. Margaret quietly covered her face. I never knew, she whispered. I thought it was only bread. Noah gently took Henry's notebook. Beside Margaret's name, he wrote, he never forgot. As they stood to leave, Margaret handed Noah a warm loaf of fresh bread. He reached for his wallet. How much do we owe you? Margaret smiled exactly as she had smiled 50 years earlier. She gently pushed his hand away. Oh no, today's bread is already paid for. David looked at the loaf, then back at the elderly baker. For a brief moment, he could almost see Henry standing beside her, smiling, as father and son walked toward the truck. Noah quietly asked, Dad, do you think Grandpa knew how many lives he changed? David looked up at the bright spring sky. I don't think Grandpa ever counted. He just kept helping. They drove away from Brookhaven. Neither of them noticed. An elderly man, sitting on a bench across the street, watching Henry's old truck disappear into the distance. Tears slowly filled his eyes, because he recognized the coat Noah was wearing, and he whispered to himself, Henry, you finally came back. David didn't notice the old man watching them leave. Neither did Noah. The pickup truck disappeared down Main Street, carrying Henry's notebook to its next destination. But the elderly man remained seated on the weathered wooden bench across from Ellis Family Bakery. His eyes never left the road. He was nearly 70 years old. His gray beard was neatly trimmed. His clothes were clean but well worn. A walking cane rested against his knee. Most people passed him without a second glance. Very few knew his name. Fewer still knew his story. He quietly whispered, Henry, you finally came back. Margaret stepped outside the bakery, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. Without saying a word, she handed one to the old man. You recognize the coat, she said softly. He nodded. I'd recognize that old coat anywhere. Margaret smiled. I thought you would. The old man stared toward the empty road. I've been waiting for this day. His name was Samuel Brooks. 40 years earlier, he had owned nothing. No home, no family, no future. Only the clothes on his back, and even those had belonged to someone else. That evening, as David and Noah drove toward home, Noah couldn't stop thinking about Grandpa's notebook. 3 names. 3 extraordinary stories. Yet there were still dozens left. Dad, he asked quietly, how could Grandpa keep all this a secret? David smiled sadly. I don't think he was trying to keep secrets. I think he simply believed kindness wasn't something you talked about. It was something you did. The following morning, there was a knock at the door of Henry's house. David opened it. Standing on the porch was Margaret. Beside her stood the elderly man from the bench. He removed his cap respectfully. My name is Samuel Brooks. I think I need to tell you about your father. Minutes later, the 3 of them sat around Henry's old dining table. Samuel looked around the familiar room. It hasn't changed, he whispered. The curtains, the clock, even the coffee smells the same. David frowned. You've been here before? Samuel smiled. Oh yes, many years ago, when I didn't deserve to. Noah quietly opened Grandpa's notebook. He searched through the pages. Near the middle, he found another name, Samuel Brooks. Underneath it, Henry had written only 4 words, never let him quit. Samuel laughed. That sounds exactly like Henry. He folded his hands. It was the winter of 1983. I had lost everything. My wife had died. My little girl became sick. The hospital bills took my house. I lost my job. I started drinking. Eventually, I lost myself. The room grew silent. Samuel continued. I slept wherever I could. Bus station, church steps, park benches. I hadn't eaten for 2 days. I hadn't spoken to another person for nearly a week. I had become invisible. David looked down. He couldn't imagine his father ever ignoring someone in need. Samuel smiled faintly. Henry didn't ignore me. One freezing morning, I was sitting outside Margaret's bakery. I wasn't asking anyone for money. I wasn't begging. I was simply too tired to keep walking. I remember watching people hurry past. They avoided looking at me, as though poverty might be contagious. Then, a man wearing a navy blue coat stopped. He looked at me, not through me, at me. Samuel's voice became softer. He asked, "Have you had breakfast?" I lead. I said yes. He smiled. "Then have second breakfast with me." Noah smiled. "That sounds like Grandpa." Samuel laughed. "It certainly does." He bought 2 bowls of soup, fresh bread, coffee. We ate together for almost an hour. He never once asked, "What happened to you?" He asked, "What was your daughter's favorite song?" David frowned. Why would he ask that? Samuel wiped away a tear. Because everyone else wanted to know how I became homeless. Henry wanted to know who I was before that. The room fell silent. Even Noah struggled to hold back tears. Samuel continued. When we finished eating, I thanked him. I stood up, and I started walking away. He stopped me. He reached into his truck and took out that coat. Samuel looked toward Noah. "The very coat you're wearing." He placed it over my shoulders. I tried to give it back. He smiled and said, "A man can't rebuild his life if he's freezing." I told him, "But you'll be cold." He laughed. "My wife knitted me enough sweaters to survive 3 winters." Everyone around the table laughed softly. That sounded exactly like Henry. Samuel smiled. "I wore that coat for nearly 3 months. When I finally found work, I washed it, folded it carefully, and drove back here. I knocked on this very door." Elizabeth answered. She smiled, as though she'd been expecting me. I handed her the coat and thanked her husband. Henry looked at me and said, "No, promise me something instead." Samuel paused. His voice trembled. "When you find someone colder than you, give them your coat." Noah slowly looked down at the navy coat resting across his shoulders. For the first time, he understood. This wasn't simply Grandpa's favorite coat. It had already warmed another life. Samuel reached into his pocket. He removed a faded photograph. It showed 2 men standing beside an old pickup truck. One was Henry. The other, a much younger Samuel. Both were smiling. Both wore the same navy coat. Henry in a sweater, Samuel in the coat. "I've carried this picture for 40 years, Samuel whispered, "so I'd never forget the day one stranger treated me like family." David stared at the photograph. He suddenly realized something. His father had never become wealthy. He had never become famous. He had never owned a large house. Yet, somehow, he had lived a life rich enough to leave pieces of himself and dozens of other people. As Samuel prepared to leave, he stopped beside Noah. He gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your grandfather didn't give me a coat. He gave me a reason to believe." He still mattered. When the front door quietly closed, neither David nor Noah moved. The house felt different, as though Henry himself had just finished telling another story. Noah slowly opened the notebook again. He carefully crossed out Samuel's name. Then he wrote, "The coat was never his. It belonged to kindness." There were still 34 names left, and somewhere among them was a story that even Elizabeth had never known. The notebook remained open on the dining room table. Its worn leather cover had become softer with every story David and Noah uncovered. Walter Morrison, Margaret Ellis, Samuel Brooks. 3 names, 3 lives, 3 reminders that Henry Collins had quietly changed the world around him without ever asking for recognition. David slowly turned another page. Halfway down, written in careful blue ink, was another entry. Evelyn Harper, Street Matthews Church. Play her favorite hymn. One more time. David frowned. Did Grandpa ever play the piano? Noah looked equally surprised. I've never seen him. Neither of them had. Henry had taught Noah how to fish, how to plant tomatoes, how to repair a squeaky door, how to bake vanilla cake, but never once had he mentioned music. 3 days later, They arrived at St. Matthew's Church. It sat quietly at the edge of a small farming community. The white wooden building was nearly a century old. Its bell tower rose above giant oak trees that had watched generations come and go. The parking lot held only 3 cars. Sunday service had ended hours earlier. The church stood peacefully beneath a bright afternoon sky. Inside, sunlight spilled through colorful stained glass windows. The sanctuary smelled faintly of polished wood and old hymn books. Everything felt still, sacred, timeless. Noah removed his cap, without anyone asking. He instinctively lowered his voice. "This place feels peaceful." David nodded. "It does." Near the altar, an elderly woman carefully arranged fresh flowers. Her movements were slow but graceful. Silver hair framed a gentle face that seemed to carry both joy and sorrow at the same time. David approached quietly. "Excuse me, we're looking for Evelyn Harper." The woman turned. Her eyes settled on Henry's navy coat resting over Noah's arm. For several long seconds, she didn't answer. Instead, a warm smile slowly spread across her face. I wondered when that coat would come through these doors again. David almost laughed. It had happened every single time. Every person somehow recognized the coat before they recognized Henry's name. "I'm David Collins. My father, Henry Collins." Evelyn gently placed one hand against her heart. "Oh, my dear Henry. So, he finally went home." David nodded silently. Evelyn walked to one of the front pews. "Come, I think your father would rather we tell stories than cry." They sat together beneath the stained glass windows. For a few moments, Evelyn simply watched the afternoon light dance across the wooden floor. Then, she smiled. "Did Henry ever tell you he used to play that piano?" She pointed toward an old upright piano beside the choir loft. David blinked. "No, I never even knew he could play." Evelyn chuckled. He would say, "I don't play well." He lied. She folded her hands. "It was 28 years ago. My husband had just died. We'd been married 52 years. When he passed, the silence inside my house became unbearable. I stopped coming to church. I stopped answering the telephone. I even stopped opening my curtains." Her voice grew softer. "I wasn't angry with God. I was simply tired." One rainy Thursday afternoon, someone knocked on her front door. She ignored it. The knock came again. Still, she remained seated. Finally, she heard footsteps walking away. A few minutes later, music drifted through her open kitchen window. Soft, gentle, familiar. Evelyn smiled through tears. It was my husband's favorite hymn, Amazing Grace, played slowly, not perfectly, but with love. I opened the front door. There, across the street, sat Henry Collins, on the old church piano they had rolled outside during repairs. He wasn't looking toward her house. He wasn't asking her to come outside. He simply kept playing. David laughed quietly. That sounds exactly like Dad. He always knew how to help without making people uncomfortable. Evelyn nodded. Exactly. When the song ended, he packed up the piano. I thanked him. He smiled and said, "Tomorrow, I'll probably play worse." Everyone laughed. So the next afternoon, he came back, and the afternoon after that, for nearly 3 weeks. Sometimes, he played hymns. Sometimes, old country songs. Sometimes, he forgot half the notes. But he never forgot to come. Noah asked softly, "Why didn't he just visit?" Evelyn smiled. "Because your grandfather understood something. When grief is fresh, people don't always want conversations. Sometimes, they only need to know someone is nearby." The sanctuary became quiet again. David imagined his father loading an old upright piano into a pickup truck, driving across town, playing music beneath a widow's window, then quietly leaving before supper, never expecting anyone to know. Evelyn slowly stood. "I have something." She walked toward the piano bench, opening a small drawer. She removed a folded sheet of yellowed music. Across the top, in Henry's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "For Evelyn," inside. The music contained dozens of penciled notes, tiny reminders Henry had written to himself. "Slow here. Smile before the chorus. Don't rush." At the bottom of the page, one final sentence appeared. "Music can't remove sorrow, but it can remind sorrow that hope still lives nearby. David carefully traced the faded pencil marks. His father had practiced, again and again, not because he wanted to become a better musician, because he wanted one grieving widow to hear hope. Evelyn quietly looked toward Noah. "Would you do something for me?" He nodded. She smiled toward the old piano. "Play one note." Noah looked surprised. "I don't know how." "You don't have to. Just one note." He walked to the piano, gently pressed a single key. Its warm sound echoed through the empty church. Evelyn closed her eyes, then whispered, "That's enough." When Henry first played, he only knew one hand. He made mistakes every few seconds, but perfection was never the point. She opened a small wooden box beside the piano. Inside were 30 folded letters, one for every year since her husband's death. Every Easter, every Christmas, every wedding anniversary. Henry had mailed her a handwritten note, always ending with the same sentence: "Keep listening. Life still has another song for you." David slowly wiped away his tears. He had spent 25 years believing he knew everything about his father. Now, he realized he had only known the chapters Henry chose to share. The most beautiful ones had been written quietly, in the lives of strangers. As they prepared to leave, Evelyn stopped Noah at the church door. She gently straightened Henry's navy coat, then smiled. "Your grandfather once told me, this coat isn't meant to stay in one closet. It's meant to keep traveling until kindness has nowhere left to go." Noah looked down at the coat. For the first time, he no longer felt like he was wearing Grandpa's clothes. Have felt as though he had inherited Grandpa's mission. Late Sunday evening, David and Noah sat quietly on the porch of Henry's old house. The summer air was warm. Crickets chirped in the distance. Elizabeth's roses swayed gently beneath the porch light. Between them rested Grandpa's notebook. 5 names had now become 5 unforgettable stories. Walter Morrison, Margaret Ellis, Samuel Brooks, Evelyn Harper. Each person had revealed a different side of Henry Collins. A veteran, a baker, a homeless man, a grieving widow. Henry had somehow found exactly what each person needed, and quietly given it to them. No applause, no recognition, just kindness. David slowly turned another page. The next name caught his attention immediately. Thomas Reed, retired mail carrier. Please thank him for delivering hope. David smiled. That's an unusual note. Noah nodded. What do you think Grandpa meant? I guess we're about to find out. 2 mornings later, they drove to a small brick house at the edge of Fairview. The front yard was filled with bird feeders. Dozens of cardinals and bluebirds fluttered happily among the trees. An elderly man watered flowers near the porch. Though his hair had turned completely white, he stood remarkably straight. When he noticed Noah wearing Henry's navy coat, he stopped watering immediately. The garden hose slipped gently from his hand. A smile slowly appeared. "I knew," he whispered. "One day, that coat would find me." David laughed softly. "I think you're the 5th person who's recognized it before recognizing my father." Thomas chuckled. That coat carried more stories than Henry ever admitted. After warm introductions, Thomas invited them inside. The living room walls were covered with framed photographs. Children, families, military reunions, wedding pictures, holiday gatherings. Most had little handwritten notes beneath them. To Mr. Reed, "Thank you for always bringing our letters." Noah quietly admired every frame. "You must have really loved your job." Thomas smiled. "I didn't deliver mail. I delivered pieces of people's lives." They settled into comfortable chairs. Thomas poured iced tea, then looked toward Henry's notebook. "So, you're discovering who your grandfather really was." David smiled sadly. "We thought we knew." Thomas nodded. So did Henry. David pointed toward the note. It says, "Thank him for delivering hope." "What did Dad mean?" Thomas laughed. "Oh, that wasn't about me. It was about him." He slowly stood, walking toward an old wooden cabinet. He carefully removed a thick bundle tied together with faded blue ribbon. Letters, hundreds of them. Their envelopes had yellowed with age. Everyone carried Henry's handwriting. Noah's eyes widened. "There are so many." Thomas smiled. "There are 1,312. The room became silent. David blinked. "I'm sorry. Did you say?" 1,300? Thomas nodded. I counted. For over 30 years. Your father wrote letters. Almost every week. David couldn't believe it. To who? Thomas looked toward the window. To anyone. Who needed someone? Thomas slowly untied the ribbon. He picked up one envelope. This one went to a little girl fighting leukemia. She loved horses. Henry drew terrible little horses in every letter. Noah laughed. Grandpa couldn't draw. Thomas laughed too. They looked more like dogs, but she adored them. He picked up another. This one belonged to a farmer who lost his wife. He and Henry wrote to each other every month for 16 years. They only met twice. Another letter. This one went to a soldier stationed overseas. Henry mailed homemade cookie recipes because, he said, even if you can't taste home, you can still imagine it. David slowly shook his head. I had no idea. Thomas smiled. Almost nobody did. You see, Henry believed something unusual. He once told me, a lonely mailbox is one of the saddest things in the world. Thomas wiped away a tear. So every week, he made sure someone's mailbox didn't stay empty. Noah quietly whispered, That's beautiful. Thomas nodded. It really was. He opened another small box. Inside were dozens of postcards. Christmas cards, birthday cards, get well notes, anniversary greetings, condolence letters, congratulations, simple thinking of you messages, every single one, written by Henry Collins. Thomas smiled. Your grandfather never needed a reason. If someone crossed his mind, he wrote. David remembered something. Every Thursday evening, Henry always disappeared into the study after supper. David had assumed he balanced bills or read newspapers. Instead, his father had spent those evenings writing hope. Thomas looked toward Noah. Would you like to hear my favorite one? Noah nodded eagerly. Thomas carefully unfolded a worn page. Dear friend, you may never know how important you are. Sometimes we imagine the world notices only loud people. It doesn't. The quiet ones keep it standing. The teacher who stays late. The neighbor who shovels snow. The cashier who remembers your name. The grandfather who tells the same story twice. The widow who still bakes cookies for children. Never underestimate ordinary kindness. Most miracles look ordinary while they're happening. Your friend, Henry Collins. The room fell completely silent. Even Thomas needed a moment before speaking again. I've read that letter at least 100 times. It still makes me cry. David smiled. It sounds exactly like him. Thomas nodded. It should. He lived every word. Thomas walked toward an old filing cabinet. He opened the bottom drawer. Inside were dozens of returned envelopes, addresses no longer valid, recipients who had passed away, letters that never reached anyone. Henry never threw them away. Instead, he wrote new addresses, found relatives, kept trying. Thomas smiled. He refused to let kindness be returned to sender. Noah quietly opened Grandpa's notebook. Beside Thomas Reed's name, he wrote carefully, Hope can fit inside an envelope. Thomas looked at the words, then smiled proudly. Your grandfather would have liked that. Before they left, Thomas handed Noah a small leather pouch. I've been saving this. Inside was Henry's favorite fountain pen, the same one he had used to write more than 1,000 letters. Its blue ink had long since dried. Thomas smiled. I think it's ready for another writer. Noah held the pen carefully, almost reverently, as though he weren't holding a pen at all, but a promise. That evening, back at Henry's house, Noah sat alone at Grandpa's old desk. He placed a blank sheet of paper in front of him, filled the fountain pen with fresh blue ink, and began writing. Dear friend. He stopped, smiled, then started again. Dear friend, I never met you, but my grandpa taught me that kindness doesn't need an introduction. Outside, the porch light glowed warmly against the night. Inside, for the first time since Henry's passing, another Collins had begun writing hope. Only the soft scratching of Noah's fountain pen disturbed the evening. At Henry's old desk, he carefully folded the very first letter he had ever written. It wasn't perfect. A few words leaned crookedly across the page. A drop of blue ink had smudged near the bottom, but Grandpa would have smiled, because Henry had often said, People remember how your words make them feel, not whether your handwriting is perfect. Across the room, David sat in Henry's favorite chair. The notebook rested on his lap. Only a handful of pages remained. Most of the names had now been crossed off. Walter, Margaret, Samuel, Evain, Thomas. Each visit had uncovered another piece of Henry's heart. David no longer wondered whether he truly knew his father. He already had the answer. He hadn't. Not completely. He slowly turned another page. Only one name appeared. There was no address, no phone number, no instructions, just 2 words. David Collins. David frowned. His own name. He looked again. Surely he had misunderstood. But there it was, written in Henry's familiar handwriting. Below it, a single sentence. The hardest person I ever learned to love was the one who looked most like me. David stared at the page. His vision blurred. Noah noticed. Dad? David couldn't answer. He simply handed him the notebook. Noah read the sentence quietly, then looked back at his father. Grandpa wrote about you. Tucked inside the page was another folded letter. Unlike the others, it wasn't sealed. Across the front, Henry had written, "After Noah has learned enough about kindness, let him read this with you." David's hands trembled. Carefully, he unfolded the paper. "My dear son, if you're reading this, then Noah has already met some of the people who changed my life. I'm glad, because before you hear my story, I wanted you to hear theirs. You probably believe this notebook is about all the people I helped. It isn't. It's about all the people who helped me become your father." David slowly wiped away a tear. Henry continued, "I have made many mistakes. Some were small. One was enormous. For 25 years, I allowed my pride to become louder than my love. That is something I will regret for the rest of my life. But here is something you never knew. Every birthday, I baked your mother's vanilla cake. Not because birthdays mattered, because I hoped, maybe, you would walk through the front door. Every Christmas, I bought one extra present. I wrapped it, placed your name on it, then quietly stored it in the attic after everyone went home." David suddenly covered his mouth. He looked upstairs. The attic. He had never once gone inside after Henry passed away. Henry's words continued. "Every Father's Day, I wondered whether you had become the kind of father I failed to be. I prayed you would become better than me. I wasn't praying because I doubted you. I was praying because I knew you deserved better than my example." David shook his head. "No," he whispered. "No, Dad." The letter continued. "When strangers thanked me, they often called me kind. They were wrong. Kindness isn't measured by how you treat strangers. It's measured by how quickly you forgive family. In that lesson, I failed. If you have forgiven me, thank you. If you haven't, I understand. But please, never spend another year wondering whether your father loved you. I always did, every single day." The room became unbearably quiet. David lowered the letter into his lap. He couldn't stop crying. Not the quiet tears he had shed at Henry's funeral. These were the tears of a son, finally hearing the words he had waited decades to hear. Noah slowly moved beside his father. Without saying anything, he wrapped one arm around him, just as Henry once had. Several minutes passed before David spoke. "I thought he'd forgotten me." Noah shook his head. "I don't think Grandpa ever forgot anyone." David smiled weakly through his tears. "I don't think so either." Just then, a small folded note slipped from inside the letter. Neither of them had noticed it before. It landed softly on the floor. Noah picked it up. There were only 2 lines. "P.S. The attic isn't empty." David looked toward the ceiling. "What does that mean?" Together, they climbed the narrow wooden staircase. The attic smelled of cedar wood and old memories. Sunlight streamed through a tiny round window. Dust floated peacefully through the air. Boxes lined every wall. Christmas decorations, old fishing gear, Elizabeth's sewing basket, and, along the far wall, 25 neatly stacked gift boxes, everyone wrapped by hand, everyone carrying the same tag. To David. The oldest paper had yellowed with age. The newest looked almost fresh. 25 birthdays, 25 Christmases, 25 years. Henry had never stopped buying gifts for the son he believed might never return. David fell to his knees. His shoulders shook with silent sobs. Noah quietly picked up the oldest package. "Dad, they're all still here." David nodded. He kept every one. There were simple gifts inside. A pocket knife, a baseball cap, a family photo, a cookbook, fishing lures, a warm scarf. Books Henry thought David would enjoy. Nothing expensive. Everything thoughtful. Each box also contained a handwritten note. Not one mentioned the argument. Not one mentioned regret. Every note ended exactly the same way. "Love, Dad." Noah looked toward his father. "I think Grandpa never stopped waiting." David smiled through tears. "No, he never did." At the very bottom of the final box, they found one last envelope. Unlike the others, it wasn't addressed to David. It was addressed to both of them. "For my boys." David carefully held the envelope. He looked at Noah. "I think we should save this." Noah nodded. "When?" David smiled gently. "When we finished Grandpa's journey." They carried the envelope downstairs. It remained unopened on the dining room table, waiting, just as Henry had intended, because there was still one final lesson left, one final destination, and one promise that would change not only the Collins family, but an entire town. The envelope remained unopened. It sat quietly in the center of Henry's old dining table. Above it, morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window. Outside, Elizabeth's roses had begun blooming again. Inside, David and Noah simply looked at the envelope. Neither of them wanted to rush this final gift. Henry had planned every step of this journey, every letter, every story, every stop along the way. Perhaps this final envelope deserved the same patience. Finally, David reached for it. He looked at Noah. "Ready?" Noah nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." The paper cracked softly as David unfolded the letter. Henry's familiar handwriting appeared one final time. "My boys, if you've reached this letter, then you've already met some of the finest people I've ever known. Not because they were perfect, because they were kind. Kindness doesn't always solve problems. It doesn't stop people from growing old. It doesn't erase grief. But it reminds us, we never have to carry those burdens alone. If you're reading this together, then my greatest prayer has already been answered. You're together. Everything else is simply a bonus." David smiled through tears. He could almost hear his father's voice. Henry continued, "There is one last favor I'd like to ask. Nothing expensive, nothing difficult. Just one afternoon. Open this house. Invite anyone who feels lonely. Set one extra chair at every table. Bake your mother's vanilla cake. Serve coffee. Tell stories. Listen more than you speak. And before everyone goes home, ask each person to perform one unexpected act of kindness for someone else. Not for me, for the next person who needs hope, because kindness should never end with one family." David lowered the letter. Neither he nor Noah spoke for several moments. Finally, Noah whispered, "So, Grandpa wants us to throw a party." David laughed. "That sounds exactly like him." "But," Noah added, "it isn't really a party." David nodded. "No, it's a beginning." That afternoon, father and son walked through every room of Henry's house, for the first time since his passing. They opened every curtain, every window. Fresh spring air filled the home. The silence disappeared. The house almost seemed to breathe again. David found an old notebook inside one kitchen drawer. On the first page, Elizabeth had written her famous vanilla cake recipe. Small stains of flour and butter covered the corners. She had obviously used it hundreds of times. David smiled. "I haven't baked this in years." Noah grinned. Grandpa would say, "We'd better not burn it." For the next several hours, the kitchen filled with laughter. Flour landed everywhere. Noah accidentally cracked 2 eggs onto the floor. David measured sugar twice. They forgot the vanilla once, then remembered just in time. When the cake finally entered the oven, the entire house smelled exactly as it had when Henry was alive. David quietly closed his eyes. For one brief moment, he wasn't standing alone in the kitchen. He was 12 years old again. Elizabeth hummed softly while mixing batter. Henry pretended to steal frosting from the bowl. Everyone laughed. The memory felt so real. It almost hurt. The following morning, David visited every house on Maple Street. He knocked on every door. Young families, retired couples, widows, single parents, even the quiet man who had lived alone for years. He handed each person a simple, handwritten invitation. You're invited to Henry Collins' house. No special occasion, just neighbors becoming friends. Noah spent the afternoon delivering invitations to the veteran's home. Walter smiled before Noah even finished speaking. I'll be there. Margaret promised to bring fresh bread. Evelyn offered to play the church piano. Thomas volunteered to help write name tags. Samuel simply smiled. I think Henry planned this long before any of us realized. Saturday afternoon finally arrived. One. People began walking through Henry's front door. Some carried pies. Some carried flowers. Others brought nothing except themselves. The dining room slowly filled. Then the living room. Then the porch. Children played in the yard. Neighbors introduced themselves to people who had lived only 2 streets away for years, yet had never spoken. Walter arrived wearing his old army cap. Margaret carried 6 warm loaves of bread. Evelyn quietly sat at the old piano David had borrowed from the church. Thomas placed a small basket near the front door. Inside were blank postcards, alongside a handwritten sign. Write to someone who might feel forgotten. Before supper, nearly every postcard had been taken. Children wrote to grandparents. Neighbors wrote to old friends. One little girl addressed hers simply, to whoever needs a smile today. Thomas quietly wiped away a tear. Henry would love this. As evening settled over Maple Street, Evelyn began playing Amazing Grace, the same hymn Henry had once played beneath her window. No one spoke. Some closed their eyes. Some quietly cried. Others simply listened. The music floated gently through the open windows. Out across the neighborhood, after dessert, David stood. He wasn't used to speaking in front of crowds. But tonight, he didn't need perfect words. He only needed honest ones. My father. He paused. I spent 25 years believing I knew who he was. He smiled sadly. I was wrong. I knew the father, but I never knew the neighbor, the friend, the man who quietly wrote over 1,000 letters, the man who carried kindness everywhere he went. He looked around the room. If you're here tonight, then somehow my father loved you. And if he loved you, then today, your family. No one applauded. They simply stood, one after another. People embraced. Old arguments quietly ended. Phone numbers were exchanged. Promises to visit were made. Lonely people discovered they weren't alone anymore. Henry's final wish had already begun changing lives. As the last guests prepared to leave, Noah noticed something unusual. The chair Henry had always sat in remained empty, but somehow it no longer felt empty. It felt reserved for every act of kindness yet to come. That night, when the house finally grew quiet again, David found one last folded page tucked beneath Henry's letter. It contained only a single sentence. If this house is ever filled with laughter again, then don't mourn me. Smile, because I'll already be home. David looked around the living room. Coffee cups still covered the tables. Children's laughter seemed to echo faintly through the hallway. The smell of vanilla cake lingered in the air. He smiled. Dad, you made it home. 1 year later, the roses outside Henry Collins's little white house were in full bloom once again. The morning sun painted Maple Street with warm golden light. Birds gathered on the old oak tree Henry had planted decades earlier. The neighborhood looked peaceful, almost ordinary. But today, nothing about Maple Street was ordinary. Today, it was Henry Collins' Kindness Day. At exactly 9 o'clock, the first family arrived carrying homemade muffins. 10 minutes later, Walter Morrison stepped out of a neighbor's truck wearing the same army cap he always wore on Veterans Day. Margaret Ellis arrived with baskets overflowing with fresh bread. Thomas Reed carried hundreds of blank postcards. Evelyn Harper smiled as volunteers carefully wheeled the old church piano into the front yard. Soon, children filled the sidewalks with laughter. Neighbors greeted one another by name. People who had once lived only a few houses apart now hugged like old friends. David stood quietly on the front porch. He looked around in amazement. Only 1 year earlier, this house had been silent. Its windows had remained closed. Its dining room empty. Today, the yard overflowed with life. He smiled softly. Dad, you'd never believe this. Then he laughed to himself. Actually, you probably would. Near the mailbox, a wooden sign welcomed every visitor. It had been carved by Noah during the winter. The words were simple: "Welcome to Henry Collins Kindness Day. If you leave with a full heart, please help someone else fill theirs." People stopped to read it. Many smiled. Some quietly wiped away tears before walking inside. The old house had changed very little. Elizabeth's kitchen still smelled of vanilla. Henry's rocking chair still rested beside the fireplace. Family photographs still covered the hallway. But one new addition immediately caught everyone's attention. Mounted beside the front door, inside a beautiful glass display case, hung Henry's navy blue coat. Beneath it, a small brass plaque read, "Henry Collins Coat." This coat warmed many people. May his kindness warm many more. Visitors stood silently before the display. Walter gently touched the glass. "I remember wearing that coat," he whispered. Margaret smiled. "I remember washing flour off those sleeves." Samuel laughed quietly. "I remember trying to give it back." Each person carried a different memory. Yet somehow, the coat belonged to all of them. Around noon, children gathered beneath the large maple tree. Noah stood before them holding Grandpa's old fountain pen. He was 12 now, a little taller, a little more confident. But when he smiled, everyone saw Henry. He cleared his throat. "My grandpa once told me." Then he laughed. "No," he wrote, "that kindness only grows when we share it. So today, I have something for everyone." Volunteers handed every child a small notebook. Blue covers, blank pages. Inside each one, the first page carried the same sentence Henry had written years before: "People who changed my life." The children looked at one another curiously. Noah smiled. "You don't have to fill it today. You'll spend your whole life filling it." Walter wiped away another tear. He really is Henry's grandson. Throughout the afternoon, something remarkable happened. Neighbors who barely knew each other began making plans. One retired mechanic offered to repair cars for widows without charge. A young nurse volunteered to visit elderly residents every Sunday. Teenagers organized lawn mowing for veterans. The local grocery store donated food to families struggling through difficult times. The town librarian started a monthly letter-writing club inspired by Henry's 1,000 handwritten letters. No one had been asked to do these things. They simply wanted to continue what Henry had started. As the sun slowly drifted west, Evelyn sat at the old piano. She looked toward David. "What shall I play?" David smiled. "The same song Dad always played." She nodded. Her fingers gently found the keys. The first notes of Amazing Grace floated across Maple Street. The entire neighborhood became quiet. Children stopped running. Conversations faded. Even the birds seemed to pause. The melody carried through the warm summer air, exactly as it had all those years ago outside Evelyn's home. David looked toward the empty rocking chair on the porch. For one brief moment, he almost expected Henry to be sitting there, hands folded, coffee cup nearby, watching everyone with that familiar gentle smile. Instead, only the breeze rocked the chair softly back and forth. David smiled anyway. Some absences still feel like company. As evening approached, Thomas Reed walked to the old mailbox. Inside, he placed dozens of handwritten letters created by neighborhood children. Some were addressed to grandparents, others to lonely veterans, hospital patients, teachers, old friends. One small envelope simply read, "To someone having a hard day." Thomas laughed quietly. "Henry, you've done it again." Just before sunset, Noah climbed onto the porch steps. Everyone gathered around. He held Grandpa's notebook in one hand and the fountain pen in the other. There was one empty page left. He said, "I've been saving it." He carefully opened the final page, then wrote slowly. Every person watched in silence. When he finished, he turned the notebook around. The words read, "The people who changed my life, Grandpa Henry, Dad, everyone here today, and the next person who needs kindness." No applause followed, only quiet smiles. Sometimes, the deepest moments don't need noise. As darkness settled over Maple Street, families slowly returned home. Children waved goodbye. Neighbors promised to meet again next month. The lights inside Henry's little white house remained glowing warmly against the evening sky. For the first time in years, the house no longer belonged to memories. It belonged to the future. Later that night, David and Noah stood alone on the porch. The neighborhood was peaceful once again. Noah looked toward the glass case holding Grandpa's coat. "Dad, I've been thinking." David smiled. "I know that look. What is it?" "I don't think Grandpa would want the coat to stay behind glass forever." David looked at him thoughtfully. "What do you mean?" Noah walked over to the display. He gently opened the small case, carefully lifted out the old navy blue coat, then hung a simple wooden sign in its place. The sign read, "Need it? Wear it. Help someone. Bring it back." David stared at his son. For a moment, he saw Henry standing there instead, not in appearance, but in spirit. He smiled proudly. "I think your grandpa would approve." Years later, visitors would often ask about the old coat hanging inside Henry Collins' house. Sometimes it wasn't there. Someone had borrowed it. A teenager delivering groceries to an elderly neighbor. A volunteer helping after a storm. A father comforting a frightened child in the hospital. Days later, the coat always came home, sometimes with a handwritten note tucked into its pocket. A new story, a new act of kindness, a new life quietly touched. The notebook beside it grew thicker every year, not because Henry kept writing, but because everyone else had begun, and somewhere beyond what we can see. Perhaps Henry and Elizabeth sat together on a quiet porch, watching Maple Street below, listening to children laugh, smelling fresh vanilla cake, seeing their family become larger than they had ever imagined. Because love, when freely given, never truly ends. It simply finds new hands to carry it forward. The end. Kindness is the only inheritance that becomes richer every time it is shared. Henry Collins.